One of the things I want to establish right from the start is that not all neurosurgeons wear cowboy boots. I just wanted you to know that. So I am indeed a neurosurgeon, and I follow a long tradition of neurosurgery, and I'm going to tell you about today is adjusting the dials in the circuits in the brain, being able to go anywhere in the brain and turning areas of the brain up or down to help our patients. So as I said, neurosurgery comes from a long tradition. It's been around for about 7,000 years. In Mesoamerica, there used to be neurosurgery, and there were these neurosurgeons that used to treat patients, and they were they knew that the brain was involved in neurological and psychiatric disease. They didn't know exactly what they were doing. Not much has changed, by the way. But they thought that if you had a neurologic or psychiatric disease, it must be because you are possessed by an evil spirit. So if you are possessed by an evil spirit causing neurologic or psychiatric problems, then the way to treat this is, of course, to make a hole in your skull and let the evil spirit escape. So this was the thinking back then, and these individuals made these holes. Sometimes the patients were a little bit reluctant to go through this because you can tell that the holes were made partially, and then I think there was some trepidation, and they left very quickly, and it was only a partial hole. And we knew they survived these procedures. But this was common, and there were some sites where 1% of all the skulls have these holes, and so you can see that neurologic and psychiatric disease is quite common, and it was also quite common about 7,000 years ago. Now, in the course of time, we've come to realize that different parts of the brain do different things. So there are areas of the brain that are dedicated to controlling your movement, or your vision, or your memory, or your appetite, and so on. And when things work well, then the nervous system works well, and everything functions. But once in a while, things don't go so well, and there's trouble in these circuits, and there are some rogue neurons that are misfiring and causing trouble, or sometimes they're underactive and they're not quite working as they should. Now, the manifestation of this depends on where in the brain these neurons are. So when these neurons are in the motor circuit, you get dysfunction in the movement system, and you get things like Parkinson's disease. When the malfunction is in a circuit that regulates your mood, you get things like depression. And when it is in a circuit that controls your memory and cognitive function, then you get things like Alzheimer's disease. So what we've been able to do is to pinpoint where these disturbances are in the brain, and we've been able to intervene within these circuits in the brain to either turn them up or turn them down. So this is very much like choosing the correct station on the radio dial. Once you choose the right station, whether it be jazz or opera, and in our case, whether it be movement or mood, we can put the dial there, and then we can use a second button to adjust the volume, to turn it up or turn it down. So what I'm going to tell you about is using the circuitry of the brain to implant electrodes and turning areas of the brain up and down to see if we can help our patient. And this is accomplished using this kind of device, and this is called deep brain stimulation. So what we're doing is placing these electrodes throughout the brain. These are, again, we are making holes in the skull about the size of a dime, putting an electrode in, and then this electrode is completely underneath the skin, down to a pacemaker in the chest, and with a remote control, very much like a television remote control, we can adjust how much electricity we deliver to these areas of the brain. We can turn it up or down, on or off. Now, about 100,000 patients in the world have received deep brain stimulation. And I'm going to show you some examples of using deep brain stimulation to treat disorders of movement, disorders of mood, and disorders of cognition. So this looks something like this when it's in the brain. You see the electrode going through the skull into the brain and resting there, and we can place this really anywhere in the brain. I tell my friends that no neuron is safe from a neurosurgeon because we can really reach just about anywhere in the brain quite safely now. Now, the first example I'm going to show you is a patient with Parkinson's disease, and this lady has Parkinson's disease, and she has these electrodes in her brain, and I'm going to show you what she's like when the electrodes are turned off and she has her Parkinson's symptoms, and then we're going to turn it on. So this looks something like this. So the electrodes are turning off now, and you can see that she has tremor.
Obviously, she has a severe tremor. You can only do DBS when the quality of life is basically removed. Does that make sense? It's your not.
We're now going to turn it on.
Stages of Parkinson's. It's at the end.
It's on. Just turn it on.
That's when they turn it on. Isn't that amazing?
And this works like that, instantly. And the difference between shaking in this way and not is related to the misbehavior of 25,000 neurons in her subthalamic nucleus. So we now know how to find these troublemakers and tell them, gentlemen, that's enough, we want you to stop doing that, and we do that with electricity. So we use electricity to dictate how they fire, and we try to block their misbehavior using electricity. So in this case, we are suppressing the activity of abnormal neurons. We started using this technique in other problems. I'm going to tell you about a fascinating problem that we encountered, a case of dystonia. So dystonia is a disorder affecting children. It's a genetic disorder, and it involves a twisting motion. And these children get progressively more and more twisting until they can't breathe, until they get sores, urinary infections, and they die. So back in 1997, I was asked to see this young boy, perfectly normal. He has this genetic form of dystonia.
So you can have genetic form of dystonia, and that's obviously what this little boy has. You can also have acquired dystonia from like a stroke, a brain injury. Does that make sense? Things like that. This case is genetic. Okay.
There are 8 children in the family. 5 of them have dystonia. So here he is. This boy is 9 years old, perfectly normal until the age 6, and then he started twisting his body. First the right foot, then the left foot, then the right arm, then the left arm, then the trunk, and then by the time he arrived, within the course of 1 or 2 years, the disease onset, he could no longer walk, he could no longer stand, he was crippled. And indeed, the natural progression as this gets worse is for them to become progressively twisted, progressively disabled, and many of these children do not survive. So he is one of 5 kids. The only way he could get around was crawling on his belly like this. He did not respond to any drugs. We did not know what to do with this boy. We did not know what operation to do, where to go in the brain. But on the basis of our results in Parkinson's disease, we reasoned, why don't we try to suppress the same area in the brain that we suppress in Parkinson's disease, and let's see what happens. So here he was. We operated on him, hoping that he would get better. We did not know. So here he is now, back in Israel, where he lives, 3 months after the procedure, and here he is.
Does DBS basically work by...
It interrupts so when things are misfiring, it interrupts that and makes it so that they can control the circuit that's basically out of control.
So it's not, so if a circuit has too much, neurons firing too much, they can suppress it by applying a negative voltage?
So they're gonna go through and balance that out. How they do the level of voltage and how they know that, I think it's through, like they sit and experiment and adjust it, they can tweak it, but I don't know that level of sophistication, because I've never done that. But I know that they sit with the clients, I've watched videos where they sit and they tweak the level of stimulation until they get the maximum level of improvement without side effects, where they can adjust that. And they'll go through and do that assessment. Usually they might have to tweak it later on. One of the flaws with DBS, specifically for Parkinson's, there have been some clients that, again, the biggest risk for DBS, I know for Parkinson's, is about a 2% stroke risk. And that's a UCSF estimate, is about a 2% stroke risk. But other weird things can happen too. Like there have been, and this isn't the norm, but there have been some people, it's random cases, but I don't have a stat on it. It's where I'm looking up and people are reporting lists of things that can go wrong, and then I'm seeing individual people say, yes, this happened to me, but I don't have an overall stat. Some people had where they had a side effect of like compulsive gambling suddenly showed up, and they had never gambled before because the particular DBS stimulator was near like the reward circuit. And it created, does that make sense? It created, so they stopped tremor, but then some of them started having sort of addictive behaviors show up. So one person started gambling wildly, and then they had to try to figure out what to do and things. But those seem to be rare cases.
Okay. And to clarify with the Parkinson's stroke case,
Yeah, they estimate about 2%.
Is that 2% compared to 2% more compared to?
It's 2% because of doing the surgery. Risk of stroke.
Oh, okay.
Because they're having to, does that make sense?
No,
So that's the biggest risk for them, and the estimate UCSF gives is about 2% risk of stroke, and that's the biggest risk they cite. And obviously for Parkinson's, like I have one of my friends has the early stages of Parkinson's, she's not eligible for DBS because she's her tremor's really, really slight, and it's nowhere near what they would ever consider for DBS. You have to have like that lady where it's very marked severe, where the quality of life for the person is unlivable. Like if you imagine trying to drink water or eat, okay, with her tremor, she's not gonna be able to function well. So it's when people are sort of at that level of difficulty, so it's not gonna be.
On the basis of this result, this is now a procedure that's done throughout the world, and there have been hundreds of children that have been helped with this kind of surgery. This boy's now in university and leads quite a normal life. This has been one of the most satisfying cases that I've ever done in my entire career, to restore movement and walking to this kind of child. We realized that perhaps we could use this technology not only in circuits that control your movement, but also circuits that control other things. And the next thing we took on was circuits that control your mood. And we decided to take on depression. And the reason we took on depression is because it's so prevalent. And as you know, there are many treatments for depression with medications, with psychotherapy, even electroconvulsive therapy, but there are millions of people, and there are still 10 or 20% of patients with depression that do not respond, and it is these patients that we want to help. And let's see if we can use this technique to help these patients with depression. So the first thing we did was we compared what's different in the brain of someone with depression and someone who's normal, and what we did was PET scans to look at the blood flow of the brain. And what we noticed is that in patients with depression compared to normals, areas of the brain are shut down, and those are the areas in blue. So here you really have the blues, and the areas in blue are areas that are involved in motivation and drive and decision making. And indeed, if you're severely depressed, as these patients were, those are impaired. You lack motivation and drive. The other thing we discovered was an area that was overactive, area 25, seen there in red. And area 25 is the sadness center of the brain. If I make any of you sad, for example, I make you remember the last time you saw your parent before they died, or a friend before they died, this area of the brain lights up. It is the sadness center of the brain. And so patients with depression have hyperactivity. The area of the brain for sadness is on red hot. It's the thermostat is set at 100 degrees. And the other areas of the brain involved in drive and motivation are shut down. So we wondered, can we place electrodes in this area of sadness and see if we can turn down the thermostat? Can we turn down the activity? And what will be the consequence of that? So we went ahead and implanted electrodes in patients with depression. This is work done with my colleague Helen Mayberg from Emory.
And again, these aren't mildly depressed or even severely depressed clients. These are extraordinarily depressed clients with a long, extensive history where therapy, medication, does that make sense? ECT, none of that works. I need to be clear. They're not like randomly popping electrodes.
And we placed electrodes in area 25, and on the top scan you see before the operation, area 25, the sadness area is red hot, and the frontal lobes are shut down in blue. And then after 3 months of continuous stimulation, 24 hours a day, or 6 months of continuous stimulation, we have a complete reversal of this. We're able to drive down area 25, down to a more normal level, and we're able to turn back online the frontal lobes of the brain. And indeed, we're seeing very striking results in these patients with severe depression. So now we are in clinical trials and are in phase 3 clinical trials, and this may become a new procedure if it's safe and we find that it's effective to treat patients with severe depression. I've shown you that we can use deep brain stimulation to treat the motor system in cases of Parkinson's disease and dystonia. I've shown you that we can use it to treat a mood circuit in cases of depression. Can we use deep brain stimulation to make you smarter? Anybody interested in that? Of course we can, right? So what we decided to do is we're going to try to turbocharge the memory circuits in the brain. We're going to place electrodes within the circuits that regulate your memory and cognitive function to see if we can turn up their activity. Now, we're not going to do this in normal people. We're going to do this in people that have cognitive deficits. And we've chosen to treat patients with Alzheimer's disease who have cognitive and memory deficits. As you know, this is the main symptoms of early onset Alzheimer's disease. So we've placed electrodes within this circuit in an area of the brain called the fornix, which is the highway in and out of this memory circuit, with the idea to see if we can turn on this memory circuit and whether that can in turn help these patients with Alzheimer's disease. Now, it turns out that in Alzheimer's disease, there's a huge deficit in glucose utilization in the brain. The brain is a bit of a hog when it comes to using glucose. It uses 20% of all your, even though it only weighs 2%, it uses 10 times more glucose than it should based on its weight. 20% of all the glucose in your body is used by the brain. And as you go from being normal to having mild cognitive impairment, which is a precursor for Alzheimer's, all the way to Alzheimer's disease, then there are areas of the brain that stop using glucose. They shut down, they turn off. And indeed, what we see is that these areas in red around the outside ribbon of the brain are progressively getting more and more blue until they shut down completely. This is analogous to having a power failure in an area of the brain, a regional power failure. So the lights are out in parts of the brain in patients with Alzheimer's disease. And the question is, are the lights out forever, or can we turn the lights back on? Can we get those areas of the brain to use glucose once again? So this is what we did. We implanted electrodes in the fornix of patients with Alzheimer's disease. We turned it on, and we looked at what happens to glucose use in the brain. And indeed, at the top, you'll see before the surgery, the areas in blue are the areas that use less glucose than normal, predominantly the parietal and temporal lobes. These areas of the brain are shut down. The lights are out in these areas of the brain. We then put in the DBS electrodes, and we wait for a month or a year, and the areas in red represent the areas where we increase glucose utilization. And indeed, we are able to get these areas of the brain that were not using glucose to use glucose once again. So the message here is that in Alzheimer's disease, the lights are out, but there is someone home, and we're able to turn the power back on to these areas of the brain. And as we do so, we expect that their functions will return. So this is now in clinical trials. We are going to operate on 50 patients with early Alzheimer's disease to see whether this is safe and effective, whether we can improve their neurologic function. So the message I want to leave you with today is that indeed there are several circuits in the brain that are malfunctioning across various disease states, whether we're talking about Parkinson's disease, depression, schizophrenia, Alzheimer's. We are now learning to understand what are the circuits, what are the areas of the brain that are responsible for the clinical signs and symptoms of those diseases. We can now reach those circuits. We can introduce electrodes within those circuits. We can graduate the activity of those circuits. We can turn them down if they are overactive, if they're causing trouble that is felt throughout the brain, or we can turn them up if they are underperforming. And in so doing, we think that we may be able to help the overall function of the brain. The implications of this, of course, is that we may be able to modify the symptoms of disease, but I haven't told you, but there's also some evidence that we might be able to help the repair of damaged areas of the brain using electricity, and this is something for the future to see if indeed we not only change the activity, but also some of the reparative functions of the brain can be harvested. So I envisage that we're going to see a great expansion of indications of this technique. We're going to see electrodes being placed for many disorders in the brain. One of the most exciting things about this is that indeed it involves multidisciplinary work. It involves the work of engineers, of imaging scientists, of basic scientists, of neurologists, psychiatrists, neurosurgeons. And it's really at the interface of these multiple disciplines that there's the excitement. And I think that we will see that indeed we will be able to chase more of these evil spirits out from the brain as time goes on. And the consequence of that, of course, will be that we will be able to help many more patients. Thank you very much.
You've got a super short clip that I want to show you as well. So that's sort of a high-tech approach, and this clip is literally 7 minutes long. So what she's going to do is simple life hacks for Parkinson's. Literally 7 minutes long. And I will take some basic notes because she's trying to deal with how do you help people's quality of life without doing big, complicated, expensive procedures and things like that, is what she wanted to work on. Not everything has to cost tons of money with these surgery days.
In India, we have these huge families. I bet a lot of y'all must have heard about it, which means that there are a lot of family events. So as a child, my parents used to drag me to these family events. But the one thing that I always looked forward to was playing around with my cousins. And there was always this one uncle who used to be there, always ready, jumping around with us, having games for us, making us kids have the time of our lives. This man was extremely successful. He was confident and powerful. But then I saw this hale and hearty person deteriorate in health. He was diagnosed with Parkinson's. Parkinson's is a disease that causes degeneration of the nervous system, which means that this person who used to be independent suddenly finds tasks like drinking coffee because of tremors much more difficult. My uncle started using a walker to walk, and to take a turn, he literally had to take one step at a time like this, and it took forever. So this person, who used to be the center of attention in every family gathering, was suddenly hiding behind people. He was hiding from the pitiful look in people's eyes. And he's not the only one in the world. Every year, 60,000 people are newly diagnosed with Parkinson's. And this number is only rising. As designers, we dream that our designs solve these multifaceted problems, one solution that solves it all. But it need not always be like that. You can also target simple problems and create small solutions for them and eventually make a big impact. So my aim here was to not cure Parkinson's, but to make their everyday tasks much more simpler and then make an impact. Well, the first thing I targeted was tremors, right? My uncle told me that he had stopped drinking coffee or tea in public just out of embarrassment. So, well, I designed the no-spill cup. It works just purely on its form. The curve on top deflects the liquid back inside every time they have tremors. And this keeps the liquid inside compared to a normal cup. But the key here is that it is not tagged as a Parkinson's patient product. It looks like a cup that could be used by you, me, any clumsy person. And that makes it much more comforting for them to use, to blend in. So well, one problem solved, many more to go. All this while, I was interviewing him, questioning him. And then I realized that I was getting very superficial information, or just answers to my questions. But I really needed to dig deeper to get a new perspective. So I thought, well, let's observe him in his daily tasks, while he's eating, while he's watching TV. And then, when I was actually observing him walking to his dining table, it struck me, this man who finds it so difficult to walk on flat land, how does he climb a staircase? Because in India, we do not have a fancy rail that takes you up a staircase like in the developed countries. One actually has to climb the stairs. So he told me, well, let me show you how I do it. Let's take a look at what I saw. So he took really long to reach this position. And then all this while I'm thinking, oh my God, is he really going to do it? Is he really going to do it without his walker? And then
That's that phenomenon of lines on the ground.
And the turns, he took them so
Different
easily.
So it allows the brain to not be stuck. So stairs.
So
don't
shocked.
allow that visually.
Well, I was too. So this person who could not walk on flat land was suddenly a pro at climbing stairs. On researching this, I realized that it's because it's a continuous motion. There's this other man who also suffers from the same symptoms and uses a walker. But the moment he's put on a cycle, all his symptoms vanish because it is a continuous motion.
That stuff.
So the key for me was to translate this feeling of walking on a staircase back to flat land. And a lot of ideas were tested and tried on him, but the one that finally worked was this one. Let's take a look.
And we'll get here in a second. Hold on. So she's going to do something on the ground. There's a super expensive walker that's like what he has that projects on the ground, a light version. Does that make sense, with lights of a lined floor? How expensive do you think that would be? Very expensive. So how practical, huh?
It could probably be made for like, a little clip that does that could probably be made for like $20.
The one that they have though, of course, is like some high tech, like sell it to like super expensive Silicon Valley person, like with $5 million. And it could be probably made very inexpensively, but that's not what they're doing at the moment. So she wanted to figure out, is there a way I can do this for hardly any cost? And so she decided to do it this way.
You walk faster, right?
If you think of things like floors that are placed in facilities that care for Parkinson's patients, you could choose the floors differently to make that work, but you also have to keep in mind people with visual problems. If you chose those floors in all hospitals, that could be harder for them. Does that make sense? So maybe you do it just in the Parkinson's wing or things like that, because different stimuli can create different problems for different folks.
It's partially the motion, but partially just seeing the lines on the ground.
It's also the lines. So remember when they showed George Carrillo and his gait froze?
Yeah.
And the doctor said, step over my foot? The phenomenon of stepping over and that stuff switched to a different motoric circuit. So part of what does that is the lines. If you've ever seen the movie Awakenings with Robin Williams, have you guys seen that? There's a scene where he's watching patients, and there's a floor that's like one of those checkerboard floors, but then there's another part where it stops, and all the patients would get stuck where it stopped, and so he started switching the floor pattern, and then they could walk all the way across. It's the visual combined with continuous motion. So does it have to be both? It doesn't, because you can't put a Parkinsonian patient on a cycle and just go. But if you have the visual plus that, then it makes it easier for them.
Okay.
Another thing that helps them is actually music. And so if you have them walking to the sound of music, so if you just have one earbud in so they can still hear, I don't know, police sirens or danger signals, you would only put one earbud in. But music can actually help them with having that continuous motion. There's different things that help them. And those are like super low cost, because you can just give a little tiny iPod.
I call this the staircase illusion. And actually, when the staircase illusion abruptly ended, he froze. And this is called freezing of gait. So it happens a lot. So why not have a staircase illusion flowing through all their rooms, making them feel much more confident?
So it would be easier in the super.
You know, technology is not always it. What we need are human-centered solutions. I could have easily made it into a projection or a Google Glass or something like that, but I stuck to simple print on the floor. This print could be taken into hospitals to make them feel much more welcome. What I wish to do is to make every Parkinson's patient feel like my uncle felt that day. He told me that I made him feel like his old self again. Smart in today's world has become synonymous to high-tech. And the world is only getting smarter and smarter day by day. But why can't smart be something that's simple and yet effective? All we need is a little bit of empathy and some curiosity to go out there, observe. But let's not stop at that. Let's find these complex problems. Don't be scared of them. Break them, boil them down into much smaller problems, and then find simple solutions for them. Test these solutions, well, fail if needed, but with newer insights to make it better. Imagine what we all could do if we all came up with simple solutions. What would the world be like if we combined all our simple solutions? Let's make a smarter world, but with simplicity. Thank you.
Do something simple like simple lights. Like they could do stuff. It's like most of the only ones I've ever seen that do the projection are super, like I would, teachers couldn't afford it, like regular people couldn't, like, Bill Gates or something could afford it, but like regular folks couldn't afford it. So I want to do a little bit of discussion, and we're going to start the essay topic. This class I haven't talked to you about Dr. Foster Santa Clara, the prof that I had in neuroscience class, right? I know you know from before, but I didn't write. Sometimes I do that at the very beginning. I don't think I did for this class. So I want to talk to you about that, and then I want to tell you a story. All right. Slow one day, not get out of the way. So when I transferred out, one of the first classes that I had, because obviously I'm coming in 2 years completed here, was an advanced topics of neuroscience class. And the particular semester I had it, the usual prof at Santa Clara was out on maternity leave, and so they had somebody come to fill in for one semester who was used to teaching pre-med students. I didn't know that at the time. and she comes in, she's a great lady, super smart, obviously, all that stuff, and so she starts lecturing, and we had a book that I just assumed was our textbook, but it was a book about that thick, and it read kind of like an encyclopedia. There were a few pencil sketches, but it was just brain regions, what they do. Very little application. And we had huge sections, and we were getting close to the first test, and she hadn't really talked a lot about how she tests. So I raised my hand, I said, you know, do you test on multiple choice, essay, a combination of both? And she looked at me and she said, "What's your name?" And I was like, so I was totally clear I wasn't at West Valley anymore, because nobody ever talked to me like that. She didn't say it rudely, but it was like, my eyes jerked up, and I'm like, "Michelle?" And I said it really tiny, and she goes, "I don't tell you that." And she goes, "What do you want me to do? Spoon feed you?" And I said, "Well, I study differently if it's multiple choice or if it's essay." And she goes, "Well, what does that mean then?" And I said, "Well, that means I have to study for both." She goes, "That's right." So I'm like, "Okay." So I'm like, and this is my first semester, so I'm like, okay, we're not in Kansas anymore, we're in like Oz, it's a totally different world, suck it up. So we go through, and she said, and then she got all irritated, because the rest of the class was scared too, like I'm the one that will shoot my mouth off, but the rest of the class was freaked out too. Does that make sense? Before I asked that, like I was the one who's willing to, like, you know, stretch my neck out and get it hacked off. But everybody else was freaked out too, so she looked around the room and she could see everybody saucer-eyed, and so she looks around and she goes, "Well, I am going to do, some of your test will be cued recall." That's how I first learned that name, cued recall. Okay, not like my cued recall. Even if you thought my cued recall was horrible, it's nothing like hers. So the day of the test, so I studied for everything. I sat and memorized stuff. I had Johnson's class. I wrote out sample essays. I wrote out 5 essays of stuff I thought she was going to cover, and memorized 5 gigantic essays. I studied multiple choice stuff. I sat in all the stuff Johnson taught me when I was here. I studied my butt off. And she had, where her class was structured different than most classes. So for her class, an A minus, I have to make sure I get this right, an A minus was 94 to 96%. You had to do 97 or up for an A, and anything below that was B or less. Okay, so I'm like freaked out. We had only the top students were taking that class. It wasn't required. And, okay, so I go through, the first test comes out, and I get to the first, you know, few fill in, and I'm doing fine. I'm like, okay, I studied my butt off. I'm all feeling proud of myself. And then I turn the page. And I turned the page, and it was her version of a cued recall essay. And there were basically no words. I don't know how to explain it. It was like the blank, 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 blank with commas and blank. Do blank. And it was like, and so my mind is like, like panicking, and I look around the room, and one of my best friends, Gary's in the room, and he has sweat pouring down his face, and like people are saucer-eyed, and I'm just like, so I walk up to the front, because I could fit, there were so many blanks at the start of it, I could think of about 3 or 4 areas of the chapters we read that could fit, because it was like it started with all blanks with commas, and so I could plug in multiple brain regions and fill in, I didn't know what she wanted, and so I walk off with my test, and I was like, hi. It's like, I can think of several areas here that would fit in, because it's all blanks, like there are no words. and then she goes again, "What do you want me to do, spoon feed you?" And I'm just like, okay, so I go sheepishly back to my desk. Everyone else is saucer-eyed, so then I figured I wasn't going to ask any more questions at that point. And so I sat back down, and I figured, okay, I'm going to pick the one I think is highest likelihood. So I'm looking at the short answer, and that covered certain areas, so I figured let me pick a different area, because it's probably likely she's going to, like I'm literally betting odds, because I could answer almost anything in there of those 3 or 4 areas that I thought would fit. So I start filling in what I think it is, and then she, from the front of the classroom, goes, "All right, let me give you guys a hint. I can see the class is struggling." And she was this really stern lady, and she goes, "Page," okay, and I'm not going to get the page and stuff right, because it's been too many years, but she goes, "Page 269, paragraph, column 2, paragraphs 5 through 8. Which meant absolutely nothing to me, because we had read select sections throughout a book this thick. I'm not visual. Like, you guys have seen my writing skills, like everything, not a visual person. So that meant absolutely nothing to me. If there were visual learners, that probably would have been almost giving the answer away. Like, that meant absolutely nothing to me. So I winged it on that one and guessed. I guessed completely wrong. I missed that whole section. And she was the hardest teacher I had, and the only reason why I did okay is because of Don Johnson's class here taught me how to memorize tons of data. That's why I test you that way. I promise it's not to like wreck your lives. It's so that when you get into classes like that, you don't crumble. So in that class at the end of the semester, 2 of us got A-minuses, I was one of them. There were a couple, nobody got an A. 2 of us got A-minuses and fought for every freaking point. There were a couple B's, a couple C's, and everyone else she shelled out the back.
Wow.
And they were the top students at Santa Clara, and she didn't curve anything. It was like, this is how it goes. I mean, she curved against us, but she didn't like curve down when people weren't doing well. It was like, you're gonna either have to retake it, or you get a D or an F. And so, in the beginning, everybody was all freaked out. She was scary, nice lady, but intimidating. And she ended up, though, inviting us to her house, and she would do study sessions with us at her house. She was the only prof that did that. She was super cool. I learned more from her than anybody I ever had. The deal is, what you have to assume is you're gonna have profs that are markedly harder than what you have here. Does that make sense? This class scared me to death when Johnson started saying we're gonna do 2 essays. And just so you know, and I think I told this class this, the way he gave it to us, we'd do the 50 multiple choice, then the short answer essay in 1 session. And I did that my whole career for about maybe 10 years, and then I switched it where I split it up to try to make it easier on students' anxiety level. And then I started dividing it between 1 week versus the next week, so you had an extra weekend. The scores actually were higher when I did it all in one day, because people were so terror-stricken, like I was in Dr. Foster's class, that it's like, mother of God, I have to have it down. Does that make sense? But stress level was also really high, so people would be like, oh my God, and they'd be so freaked out, and I didn't like seeing them. The deal is, what you have to assume, and it's true, is that if the human mind can learn it, your mind can learn it. Does that make sense? And it truly is. If the human mind can learn it, your mind can learn it. And so your task is to figure out, how do you have to study it based on how your mind works? So I have a processing disability. You guys see all my squirrely stuff that I do, and I do glitches, and I can't spell to save my life. If I can learn how to spell the structures, you can't. Like seriously, it's like a gerbil. It's like having a gerbil learn to spell, because I can't spell. And so if I learned how to spell it, you can learn to spell it. And those structures, and so you have to figure out what you're good at. And so for me, I'm really good at music, I'm good at conversation, remembering dialogue. So like when I would have clients, I would remember exactly what they said each session, just because they're really interesting and I have good auditory memory. So I studied on tape. And I was telling one of you guys in my office, so I'm really old, so iPhones and that stuff didn't exist yet. That old, I know, it's scary. Anyway, we did have phones, just not those kind of phones. You're like, was it prior to phones? No. Okay. But I used to have a fast play tape recorder, and the reason why I tell students this is because if you do a fast play tape recorder, and I assume there's probably an app that does fast play, when you would record, it would play it back so you sounded like a chipmunk. So I would write out my essay and then play it back, so it's like, okay, there's categories of neurons, and it sounds ridiculous, and because it sounds ridiculous, you pay attention more. And because it's fast play, you get through each repetition of the entire essay faster, which means that if I'm studying for, say, 2 hours, I get more repetitions each time. And then the deal was I would play that when I'm driving to and from work, to and from school, to and from volunteer work. I would do it when I'm brushing my teeth, when I was making and eating breakfast. And then when I was driving, obviously not when I'm eating breakfast, because you can't talk, because food would go everywhere when you're brushing your teeth. But when I was driving, I would say the essay with the tape recorder. And if I couldn't do that, then I would rewind it. Does that make sense? At the point that I would get lost. Well, not when I was driving, the rewind part, but the other part when I was sitting and things like that, or walking, then I'd rewind it. And just do it over and over and over and over again. And so the goal is you have to know essays like, you know, your phone number. Okay, you know it backwards and forwards. You can do it super easy. Then you hand your notes to a friend or family member, and you just go through and say, like I told you guys before, say it out from start to finish. If you can't do that, you haven't studied enough. Now what will happen is a lot of times students will say, well, I have sections I know, but I have blanked out sections. And all that means, it doesn't mean you can't do physio, it doesn't mean you're not talented, it doesn't mean any of the things that students get freaked out about. All it means is you need a little bit more study time. That's it. It means you need to spend a couple more hours. Usually it's about 2 more hours, sometimes 3 more hours study time from when you've got chunks of it learned to when you have it hammered. Does that make sense? So it means you have to set aside the time to study to get that down, okay? So that's that. Then there's a second story that's unrelated, but it's going to relate to something else in a second, so I'm going to do it all in one day. Okay, so when I was also at Santa Clara, I had one of my, I'm super shy, and I always sat in the back corner. I wouldn't talk unless somebody pissed me off, or unless I was terrified for advanced topics in neuropsych class. But those were the only times that I would talk, and otherwise I would just sit and take notes, and I was super quiet. And there was a young lady in one of my classes, and the only way I can explain it is, you know how when you walk into a room of people you don't know, there are certain people where you're like, that person would be my friend, like they just seem like one of your people. She was like one of my people, and I didn't know why, but she just seemed like she would be one of my friends out of the gate. And it turned out that once I started going to each of the first classes the first semester, she was in all the hard classes with me. She was in the advanced neuropsych class. She was in the ones that were the harder ones that most of the students didn't want to take because they're afraid to. And so we talked, you know, after classes, and oh my God, can you believe how hard that test is, and brief stuff like that, but that was about it. And then this one day, she was also in a lit class that I had with one of the priests on campus. And that particular class, everybody sat in the back because he was a person who would call on people randomly who sat in the first 2 rows. So everybody shoved in the back. And this one day, I was out sick, and I went to his office hours to get the assignment, because this was before everything was on the net and all that stuff, to get the assignment. And he gave me the assignment. That took him about 10 minutes, and then he just started telling me about his life. I didn't ask about his life. Priests actually make me a little nervous. I like them and respect them very much, but I get kind of nervous around them. And so I wouldn't have been like, tell me about your life, sir, because no, anyway. But he started telling me all about his life. He talked about a heart attack he'd had and fears of death. He talked about why he became a priest. He talked about all sorts of stuff. And it was super interesting. He talked about different languages he spoke and different experiences with teaching, all this stuff. And so I'm sitting and listening to him. And about an hour and a half goes by. And then he looks sort of startled at how much time has gone by. And he goes, oh my God, I can't believe I talked that long. And he's like, I'm so sorry. And he goes, let me go ahead and let you go. And so I go, okay. So then that was on a Monday. And then the next class I had for him was Wednesday. And on that day, I happened to be late. I got caught in traffic. I lived off campus. And I got caught in traffic. It was way worse than normal because there was an accident. And all the back rows were taken. So I had to sit in the front. And when I sat in the front, that one young lady, I'm going to call her Mary, is not a real name, but she always sat in the front, and so I was sitting next to her, and we did this whole big discussion in class and debate. For the people who had me for Psych 1, that was the one with the story I tell the Psych 1 class about the mascots. Anyone who had me for Psych 1? Okay, anyway, those who had me should hopefully remember that, but anyway, that was that same class. And after that discussion, she followed me after class, and she said, she wanted to know about stuff I had talked about in that class, and she followed me after class, and she said, you know, you've been in a lot of classes that I've been in, and she goes, and for whatever reason, you seem like you'd be one of my friends. And so she was like, same sort of reaction. She was just one of my people. I can't explain it. I don't know why. Anyway, and she said, can I talk to you for a little while? And I said, sure. And so we went to the psych department student area. It was sort of a couchy kind of hangout area. And she started just telling me about her life. And she started talking about how she had been sexually abused by her dad all through her childhood. She talked about how her mother blamed her for the abuse. This was one of the first cases I was hearing of this because I hadn't started specializing yet. But I now know that's super common, where the non-abusive parent blames the kid. Does that make sense? For what's happening is super common. And I knew that to a degree, but I didn't know exactly how common it was yet. She talked about that her dad had gotten a terminal case of cancer, and I don't know how you guys view the world, but I would sort of assume, sometimes I get tears in my eyes when I tell the story because I am worried about this. I would assume that if somebody was going to die, and they did that, they'd apologize. And so she's telling me this story, and I'm hoping, you know, where you're hoping it's going to go like in a better direction than you think it's going to go. And he didn't do that. In fact, it was her gender and her birth order and her culture, which I'll leave out to protect her privacy. She was put in the position where she had to be the caretaker for her dad, who had sexually abused her because of the gender of her birth order. And so she had to like nurse him while he's dying. And in fact, some of the last sentences he ever said to her was blaming her for what he did. So she's telling me all this, and I have tears in my eyes when I'm listening to the story, which is why I have them now, because I can see her face in my head. Anyway, and so she's talking about this, and then she goes, and oh, by the way, for the past, and I think it was 3 months, but it might have been longer than that. She said, for the past X number of months, I've been living in my car. And I was shocked, and I was shocked not because I don't know there are homeless people, and not because I don't know that happens, but I was shocked because she was at Santa Clara on a 100% academic scholarship, which is super hard to get. She was, and she was always looked put together. Like, I will sit and straighten my really frizzy, naturally frizzy hair every morning, and then I walk outside, it's all like, and I'll like iron my skirt, and then I walk outside and it's wrinkled, and she always looked put together. Do you know what I mean? Like, everything looked all put together. She was getting straight A's. I knew she was working and going to school. I knew she was on 100% academic scholarship. She was talking about, after each test, I have to get 100% of my grades have to be A's or I'll lose my scholarship. And I don't know a whole lot, but even then I knew no scholarship requires every single test be an A. And I told her that. I'm like, that's just not true. I don't know everything, but I know that's not true. You have to get good grades, but you don't have to have where every single test is an A. You're putting too much pressure on yourself. And so she's talking in those ways. And I naturally safety plan. I'm a worrier, so I'm trying to figure out, well, where is she living? And so I'm like, I said, you know, do you have friends in the area? And she said, I do. And she goes, but I don't want to be a burden on them. She goes, so on certain days I'll go and I will, you know, if it's, I'm particularly exhausted or things like that, I'll go and I'll stay on a friend's couch and things, but I don't want to be a burden on them. And so I'm trying to explain that, no. To be a friend means that you allow people to help you and you help them, and it's like, that's like two-way street. And she's like, yes, I know that, but I don't want to be a burden on them. So that was like, she wasn't budging on that. So I'm sitting there trying to figure out stuff, and I said, okay, what does your average day look like? And she said, well, I go to school, and then she did volunteer work, and she did all this stuff. And then she would study at Santa Clara Library, the school library, until it closes. And I can't remember if it closed at 10 or 11, but somewhere around there. And then she said, and then I sleep in my car. And I said, okay, so I'm hoping she has like some giant van with no windows and she's in the back and nobody can see her. So I said, what kind of car do you drive? And she said, I drive a 1970s Honda Civic. So that would be like today, like a Mini. Like in the mini, not the bigger like Countryman. Like, okay, so I'm 5'9", she was 5'8.5". So it's like moose-sized person in a little tiny vehicle. So how well do you think she was hidden? Not particularly well. So she would tip the seat all the way back and then sleep in there. She still had gym membership from a 20-hour fitness thing, so she would get showers each day. And she had some kind of a steamer thing she would use. That's why her clothes always looked put together and stuff like that. And what had happened was she was from a family with tons of means, and when the dad died, even though the dad was abusive, the dad was what protected her to a degree. It was like a strange family dynamic. When the dad died, the mother cut her off 100% of all financing and knew she was homeless and wouldn't help her. That's how she qualified for the 100% scholarship. So I'm hearing all this, and I didn't know what else to do. So I'm like, okay, so I figured her friends aren't really good friends, is what I figured. I don't know how to explain that, because it's like, you're my friend and you're sleeping in the car. Like, I will come and stand outside your window and not let you sleep and like stuff you in my car. Does that make sense? Like, I am a pushy friend. So I figured she doesn't have enough pushy friends, so I'm like, look. So I was like, okay, and I didn't say anything bad about her friends, but I was just like, okay, she doesn't know pushy people. So I said, look, I have a one-bedroom apartment that's off campus, and this was at the beginning of, this conversation that we had was the last semester before we graduated. She was almost to her degree at this big thing where she's telling me all this. And I said, I know enough about trauma that I know that, you know, folks can feel uncomfortable. And I said, you can have the bedroom, it's got a locked door, and I can stay on this other part of it where there's a, you know, like a futon type thing, and I can sleep there, and you can stay there, and you can be behind a locked door. I'm like, I don't hurt anybody, but in case. She's like, no, I can't possibly do that. I can't be a burden on. Then I'm thinking, she doesn't know me. This is the, you know, aside from saying hi, this is the first conversation. So I said, look, I can stay at my friend's house that lives in this area, and you can have my apartment for the month. I said, it's already prepaid, because I figured if she's then in the apartment, and I'm literally like trying to like hang my keys on her body, almost like trying to get her to take them. Because I figured once I got her in the apartment, then I could figure out how else to help. Does that make sense? And I knew my friends would let me stay there. And so she's like, no, I couldn't possibly do that. And then I thought, you know the rule of reciprocity, where if somebody does a favor for you, you feel obligated. So I figured I'm trying to do a favor for her, and she hasn't done one back. So then I figured, okay, at the time I had an iguana. So I'm trying to think of everything I know about psych to like help get her to do this. So I'm like, you can stay in the apartment in exchange for feeding my iguana, Robbie. She's really cute. She's got little tiger stripes. I'm like, you know, and I'm trying to like, you say in exchange for like staying there for free. And she's like, no. You guys are like, oh my God. Then I'm like, what if she's afraid of lizards? Sorry, this is my mind. Anyway, so I'm sitting there trying all these things. None of that's working. So then I'm like, okay. So I said her name, which isn't Mary, but we'll call her Mary, and I said, have you ever thought about telling one of the profs about this, and I said, I don't have access to hotel vouchers and things like that, but I know they do. And she goes, that's why I'm telling you this whole story. And she said, I've never told anyone I was abused before. And she said, I want to go and ask them for resources, but I don't want to go by myself, and you just seemed like somebody who would go with me. And she said, would you do that? And I said, absolutely. So I said, have you thought about a prof you would want to talk to, that you'd feel comfortable? She said, I picked two, and she picked the same two I would pick, and she picked them in the same order. It's like we had the same mind. Anyway, and so we go first to my second favorite prof, and we go into his office, and he had resources for like counseling and a bunch of stuff like that, food resources and that stuff. Then we went to my absolute favorite prof, and we go in there, and she's just talking. I'm just sitting there quietly, and she's explaining why I'm in the room to them. And he gave all kinds of resources, and again, this is before everyone had cell phones, and that prof was wise enough to say, can you give me the phone number for the friend you sometimes stay on their couch, so that he had some phone number on her. And then he did a whole bunch of, other questions and things, and then she disappeared. We finished that session, and she stopped coming to class, and she had never been absent before. So I'm freaked out. I'm like, oh my God, she's in a dumpster. She's like, I'm freaked out. So I'm going and talking to the profs and trying to figure out, like, where is she? And that one prof was calling the friend's house, trying to get a hold of her and stuff, and the friends didn't know where she was, and all this stuff. And so I'm super worried, and weeks and weeks go by. It's literally this last semester before we get our bachelor's. She's on a 100% academic ride. She's disappeared now for a couple weeks. And then this one day I see her in the hallway, and it's just like, thank God, so she's alive. Thank God. It's like, we have a person. And so I go up to her, and she's like getting ready to go to a different class that we didn't have in common. And she goes, wait, come here, let me talk to you. And she goes, the strangest thing happened. She goes, that day, after I met with you guys, I went to my friend's house. She decided to spend that night at her friend's house. And her mom, who was verbally abusive and all that stuff, would periodically call the friend. And I don't know how to explain this, because I'm not going to say quotes of what the mom used to say to her, but the mom would basically call her daughter that she cut off economically, that she blamed for her sexual abuse from the dad, and would basically call her, from what I can say, is to call her to like degrade and put down her daughter. Like, it's the only thing that I can describe, because it was like verbal abuse, and I still don't 100% understand like what is, you know what I mean, like at least leave her alone. But she would periodically call there, and so she happened to stay at the friend's house that night, and the mom called, starts putting her down, and then my friend says, in passing, that she happened to tell one of the students on campus and two profs about her childhood. And miraculously, the mother suddenly wires truckloads of money to her daughter overnight. Now, I don't think it's because some random Santa Clara University peer knew what happened. I think it's because she knew two Santa Clara University profs knew what she had done to her daughter. Does that make sense? So she wired her a truckload of money, like thousands of dollars. And this was back when you had to have first and last month's rent. There are times where all rental places require that, and then there have been times I've seen, because I'm old, where they slack off on that and they just say first month's rent and a small deposit. There's times where they do first and last month's rent plus a security deposit. This was one of those times where the rental market was really tight, so it was first and last plus security, and she didn't have that. And I didn't have it. I was putting my way through Santa Clara. I would have given her money, and I didn't have it. And so the mom wired her all this money, and she goes, I got a studio apartment, and she said, I got a little futon and all that. And the reason why she hadn't been coming to class is once she had a locked door, all the trauma that she had came up. So if this was her bedroom, and that's the front door, and she had her little futon over here, she was literally curled up on the floor over by her futon, staring at the door, flooded with flashbacks of all the stuff that happened to her. And I said, okay, you know this is normal because you know what trauma does. Your system didn't let that happen when you were in the car because she's still in a crisis. Does that make sense? And it wasn't safe for her system to do that then. It's like, a Vietnam vet doesn't usually have flashbacks out in the field of battle. It's when you get back home. Does that make sense? Then all that stuff comes back. And so she goes, no, I do know that. She said, it's PTSD. She goes, I know what it is. And she said, I totally know what all of that is, but that's why I wasn't here for a while. And then she disappeared again. So she was there that one day, and then she disappeared again and never came back. One semester shy of getting her bachelor's. Her goal was to be a child psychologist, and I think she would have been fabulous. She got straight A's. She did beautifully in her classes. She was asking for additional assignments for volunteer work and all the stuff that was required, and she did great with everything. Everybody liked her, the peers did, her profs did. She would have had great letters of rec. So I kept going back every couple of years to my favorite prof to see if she ever went back to finish her degree. She was one semester shy, and I don't know that he's supposed to tell me, so I never tell which prof that is, because I don't know if he's like legally allowed to tell me, because I don't think he probably is. Today I know he wouldn't be, but I don't know about back then. But she never went back, and she never requested her transcripts to be sent out. There was one point where he called her again and because he had gotten her new phone number that one day she was there. And I remember him, and he said, Michelle's in the room, is that okay if I tell her what you're saying? And she said yes. She had gotten a job, and I remember the prof saying, did you tell them that you have all your work done at Santa Clara University except one semester? Because he goes, I think at that place you're working, you would qualify for like a managerial position because of your education. And she apparently told him, no, no, no. I didn't want the people to know that because I'm embarrassed I haven't finished yet. So she wouldn't even like disclose how much education she had to help her financially because she felt embarrassed. And he said, okay, and we kept trying to encourage her to come back, and she never came back. And to my knowledge, and I mean, I checked for like over a decade, and never went back, never had her transcript sent. And it breaks my heart, which is why I always get upset. So now I'm grown up, and I have access to resources. I have a book of resources for all kinds of stuff. And so one of the best resources is that 211 number, and it has 140 languages. And it also includes, if somebody is deaf, they will do the texting if somebody is deaf, and it's 140 languages, and it's over 300 agencies, over 1,000 resources. It's like 911 for social services, and it's available through the whole country. So I used to always give huge packets of photocopied resources to people, because I have huge books that I got for vouchers and all of that. They can give you access to food, hotel vouchers, they can check shelter bed availability, all that stuff. They do more than that. They do stuff like domestic violence shelters, all those kinds of things, but they also do legal services, immigration services. They also do things like employment help if you're having trouble finding work. They do all kinds of stuff, and it's a great resource. And then there's other resources that I am more learning about now. There's a pastor and his wife in East Palo Alto for homeless folks. If you think about trying to go to job interviews or things like that, it's very difficult, obviously, to do that. You don't have an address and all those things, and it's also hard to keep clean. And so they went, and Santa Clara County went and chipped in, and Hotel and all these groups chipped in and did a mobile, which I love this, shower and laundry facility that drives to homeless encampments once or twice a week. And folks get showers there because they said when they talk to homeless people getting on buses, when you're not clean, people stare. Does that make sense? So they drive to them and let them do one load of laundry and give them a shower once or twice a week, depending on the location. And that is called We Hope. It's Dignity on Wheels. And there's all kinds of resources, and those folks can hook you up with any resource you need. There's resources on campus and scholarships and all sorts of stuff. So the deal is, the reason why I always tell that story about my friend is because it kills me that she didn't get her dream met of what she wanted to do for her life, and she was more than capable intellectually and everything. But the one thing she didn't have was enough flexibility to ask us for help beyond that initial request. Does that make sense? She was able to do that one request, but beyond that, she wouldn't let anyone help her beyond that. And so the deal is, if you need help with anything, with studying for this test coming up, this next test, if you need help with any of those kinds of things, let us help you. We have tutorial services, and I've got a great tutor, and she's available. It's free, and so it's on the Success Center website, and she's there multiple days per week. I usually have 2 people. Sarah's not here now. I think she's off in grad school, but I've got another tutor who's wonderful as well, and that's free for you. We have counselors on campus. We have all kinds of things. The people on campus have access to vouchers and all sorts of stuff. So if you're in a situation where you're homeless, if it's other stuff, if it's where you study tons and tons and tons, but you can't encode the data, you might have like a processing disability like I do. Does that make sense? Not all of them are sort of formal learning disabilities like dyslexia that usually gets screened out when you're younger. There's other ones that are more subtle. And so if you find that you study for every class, not just this class, but many classes, and you can't encode the data and you spend hours and hours and it doesn't work well, then go get tested at DESP. Does that make sense? Let us help you. And so that's why I tell that story. I will shut up now, but it's my one effort is trying to get people to come and ask and let us give you resources, because we have tons of them. But that one is one, and it's 24/7. They'll even, when you listen to the voicemail, and I called them on Monday, and it took 5 minutes for me to get a person on the line, and she was lovely. But they also have where you can text them your zip code, and I think it's 898-211, and then you text their zip code, and then they'll text you back resources you need. But the easiest way is to talk to the actual human being, and it's not the same as 411 that just gives you resources, because they sit and try to help problem solve. It's kind of like a counselor on the phone. Okay, so whatever that's worth, I will shut up. My dad used to always say I'd run on like some soapbox. I will shut up now. Anyway, okay, so here we go. Kills me, she didn't finish her degree. It just kills me. One semester dry. I'm driving me crazy for the rest of my life. Okay, stress continuum. So the people who have had me for Psych 25, the first part of this is gonna be like what you learn in there, and then there's gonna be a second part to it. So I'm gonna start with this part. Now this visual of this is like a super simplified version of Sapolsky's research, uber simplified, okay? Capitalized, looks bad on this. Okay, so, I'm gonna do Gazelle then. So we're gonna do Gazelle and human examples. If you ever get a chance to hear Robert Sapolsky speak, and I got to hear him, and I think, and I'm getting so old, I'm not sure I'm remembering the right place. There used to be, I saw him speak a couple times. I think his, and I'm not positive, I think his was through, there used to be a group called Cortex, and it's seminars, and it was where it was sort of physio-psych-based stuff, and it was, but the fees were super cheap for students. It was the greatest thing ever. And then some other group bought them out, but if you still type in Cortex seminars, at least a few years ago, they would tell you the new name of it. And I got to see people from, like he's from Stanford, obviously, but I saw people from Yale and all over the place for super low fees. If you do regular seminars, usually with top researchers, it's more expensive. And I think that's where he did those, but I'm not positive for the times I saw. But he's super funny, and if you ever get a chance to hear him speak, go. So for gazelle, the frequent mild stressor would be if you're, let's say, a little gazelle, and he would talk about if you're a little gazelle and you're grazing on a patch of grass, and there's better grass over there. You'd like to graze over there, but there's a bigger, meaner, tougher gazelle over there, so you can't. So you're kind of stressed out because you have the less high-quality gazelle grazing land. That would be like a frequent mild stressor for like a little tiny gazelle. For a human, it would be stuff like you finish a stack of blue books and then you get 5 more stacks, okay? Or you're going to a job interview and you're running late. Does that make sense? It's like day-to-day nonsense. Okay, you're going to class and you're stressed out, or you're getting ready to study for your physio test and you misplace all your notes. I used to do that all the time. When I was a student, right before I was going to study for like a huge session, I would like misplace them and I couldn't find them and I'd be all freaked out and they'd be like right in front of me. Those are frequent mild stressors, okay? Your body can handle those. Those aren't a big deal, okay? They're irritating, but they're not a big deal. Transient severe stressors, these are emergency situations. Now, I always put a slight qualifier on that. in certain cases, it could be or a perceived emergency, but usually 99% of the time, it's gonna be emergency situations that last maybe 5 to 10 minutes. And the reason why Sapolsky does the estimate of 5 to 10 minutes, you'll see in a minute, okay? So for a gazelle, you know, maybe the example for a gazelle for a transient severe stressor would be the little gazelle's walking through an area, and then he or she sees a wildcat, and then the wildcat is either going to catch him and eat him, or he's going to get away in about this amount of time. Does that make sense? That's why he does that time frame. So we'll talk about what's going to get activated and all that stuff. So maybe a gazelle coming into contact with a wildcat would be the example for here. So. And we'll talk about what's going to happen in a minute. For a human, and I have some examples that were before you guys were born, but like the '89 earthquake was really scary. I love earthquakes. I usually think they're fabulous and clap and laugh because I think they're a blast. Anyway, it's like a roller coaster. This one, not so much, okay, because this one was really scary. It was like furniture was falling. It was terrifying. Anyway, that was the only one that not so much. But usually it's like, hey, free roller coaster. Anyway, it's my general perception. This one was scary. It can be like school shootings. And I had a couple semesters ago where I was listing the latest school shooting, and I had one student who happened to have me 3 semesters in a row, and it kept changing which school shooting I was listing, and I didn't make the mental connection. She's all, I had you 3 semesters in a row, and there's been a new school shooting each one. And she goes, I don't know if you realize that, and I didn't, and how sad is that? So emergency situations, severe things that happen, that could be a severe traffic accident, things like that. Where it's very scary for a brief period of time. Now, it doesn't mean that after a school shooting or after a really severe earthquake, it doesn't mean that everybody's all super calm and relaxed, because after a scary earthquake, you're worried about aftershocks. After something like this, you're dealing with grief and fear. Does that make sense? It doesn't mean that everything's back to normal, but the height of the fear is over within a brief span of time. Does that make sense? Okay. So for transient severe stressors, the sympathetic nervous system is activated. Now, we did this before. I'm going to scream through the list again. Come test time for this, you have to be able to list 2 or 3 of the things I'm going to list, okay? So I'm going to go screaming through. We did this before. So it's going to cause things like your pupils to dilate, okay, to let in more light. It's going to cause things like heart rate and respiration rate acceleration, or your heart rate and respiration rate will speed up if you prefer to word it that way. It will cause things like perspiration to increase. It will cause things like a spike in glucose, so you have instant energy. It will cause a spike in adrenaline, okay? You'll get tear gland stimulation, so if I'm running through a big grassy field and I get schmutzy stuff in my eyes can clear that out quicker. It will cause activation of most parts of the body, as we talked about before. This one's the one that, if you remember before, is known as the fight, flight, freeze response. It will activate most systems, but it will cause an inhibition of 2 systems. We talked about this before, but I just want to remind you. So it will cause an inhibition of urinary bladder contraction. So again, in an emergency, if I'm being chased by a bear, I don't want to say to the bear, excuse me, I have to go use the loo, I'll be right back. Okay. And the one exception, if you remember before when we talked about that, when we did the breakdown, is if a person happened to have a very full bladder at the time of the emergency, this system, the sympathetic nervous system, will automatically evacuate, and the person will wet their pants, basically. Young or old, doesn't matter. The second thing that it inhibits is, again, digestion, so that if I'm being chased by a bear, I'm not going to use all that energy to break down a tuna fish sandwich I had or something like that. But for the most part, this is about activating with those 2 major systems as an exception. Then after that happens, the parasympathetic nervous system gets activated. And that one again is the PANS, and you guys know this from before. Then this one gets activated. And again, this one works like the checks and balances for the sympathetic nervous system. So it's basically going to do everything in the opposite. So you're going to get, the pupils will constrict back to normal. You'll get a deceleration of heart rate and respiration. You will get glucose and adrenaline going back down to normal. So again, deceleration of heart rate and respiration. You will get glucose and adrenaline going back to normal. You'll get tear gland inhibition. Perspiration levels will go back to normal, and then you'll get activation for this parasympathetic nervous system, and again, that one's known as the feed and breathe response. I've got a room at the bottom, so right here. You had this before. And then it will cause activation of urinary bladder contractions, so that after the emergency's over, that's when people have a sense, oh, I need to use the restroom. It will also cause activation of the digestive tract. So after the emergency, if I get in a big car accident, like chewed up my arm in an accident or something like that, now is when my body wants to break down the sandwich I had to keep my system, my immune system and all of that strong to be able to start to repair things. That's when it wants to use the energy to do that. So transient severe stressors, they are typically emergency situations and they can be scary, but we have a system designed to handle those, okay? Does that make sense? Okay? These ones are different. So humans and animals experience frequent mild stressors and transient severe stressors. This one's humans only. And I will do one qualifier to do with that in a minute. And there's 3 prolonged severe stressors. 3 categories. So the first, I don't like how close that is to that, are called environmental stressors. Now, environmental stressors include things like domestic violence, child abuse, living in a war-torn area, it could be living in like a dangerous neighborhood. So for example, the example that I always give is I had a couple clients, but one family always comes out. I had a client family who, they were a super safe, happy, it wasn't a domestic violence household, everybody was lovely, it was a super nurturing family, and part of why they came to see us is they wanted resources to try to help them get out of their neighborhood. It was a super loving, peaceful family. They happened to live in an area where there were drive-by shootings. And one of the things that happened for them is that they had a front room with a big picture window. The front door is here. There's like a living room here that you had to pass through that to get to the bedrooms here, and then like kitchens over here. And they had, and nobody was aiming at this family, but because there were a lot of drive-bys in their neighborhood, one of the times they had where a bullet went flying through and then embedded in the back wall in this front room. So the deal was they had to like run through the room. Does that make sense, to go to the back bedrooms because they were always afraid? And they were asking for resources to try to get out of that neighborhood. These ones are called prolonged severe stressors. Now, is it where the stressors are happening 24/7? No. Even in domestic violence, do batterers like beat and call names and yell at people 24/7? No, they do intermittently. You never know when they're going to do that. And because you never know when they're going to do that, you're scared all the time. Does that make sense? You're scanning the environment all the time, and that's called hypervigilance. These environments create hypervigilance. It is created by prolonged severe stressors for many clients. And hypervigilance is when you're constantly scanning the environment for signs of danger, okay? And so I always give examples from my clients, and I do, I'm gonna focus on child abuse examples. I've worked with kids that, little boys and little girls, different ages, but would say things like, I know how, and for little kids, they'll often talk about the abusive parent as violence being the same as angry. It's not the same. Anger doesn't cause violence, but little kids have trouble understanding that, so you have to teach them that. So I'm doing quotes from before I taught them that part. They'll say things like, I know how angry my daddy is or my mommy is, whoever the violent person is in the family, by the way the key goes into the front door, or by the cadence of the footsteps approaching the front door. Well, if you think about your average 5-year-old or 8-year-old or 9-year-old, they're not sitting and listening to like how forcefully their parent puts their key in the front door or the cadence of the footsteps. I don't know what they're doing. They're playing, they're talking to their dog, they're doing whatever they're doing, reading inside, but they're not having to worry about that. But these kids in these households do have to do that because it's part of survival. And so they're constantly scanning that environment. What a lot of adults will talk about is it's like I'm walking on eggshells, I'm constantly terrified I'm going to do the wrong thing or set that person off. And that's part of that sort of heightened fear state. I worked with other kids. I worked with a little kid that she used to, and her parents thought that she was doing this because she just loved stuffed animals. I knew what the real reason was. I'm going to tell you what the real reason was. She used to take all her stuffed animals, and she had a lot of them, and put them all over her bed when she was going to sleep. And her parents just thought it was because she liked, all the little bunnies and critters. What she was doing was a little kid safety plan. I call her my E.T. kid. If you've ever seen the movie E.T., where E.T. hides in the closet, he's like this, and there's all these stuffed animals, and he's trying to blend in. She had never been physically hurt in her household. It was a domestic violence household, but she was seeing her mom get beaten by her dad. That's still abuse. Does that make sense to the child? Because obviously seeing that is terrifying. She herself, though, had never been physically hurt. But she assumed, and she was a tiny little kid, single digits, okay, I'm not going to give her exact age, but single digits, and she assumed that if my dad did that to my mom, eventually my dad's going to what? Do that to me. So she put all the toys all over her bed because what she told me was, so when my dad comes to grab me and hurt me, he might grab, like Mr. Whiskers the bunny instead of me. And if he does that, I'll have a split second, I can run out of the room. Okay, you guys know, what do you think? Will the dad recognize the difference between the daughter and Mr. Whiskers the bunny? Yes, okay, you guys know that, but this was a little kid. And so from a little kid perspective, it's like a little kid kind of magical thinking safety plan. Okay, it's a heartbreaking safety plan, but it's a type of safety plan. I had a little boy that in the household, in his bedroom, they had a trundle bed. Does everybody know what a trundle bed is? Where it's like a bed that slides under another one, and then you bring it up, and it's like a temporary bed. And they used that other bed for another kid in another room, so he basically had kind of a higher up bed than a normal bed, with the trundle being used for another sibling. And he would get all tucked in, and then after he was tucked in and the lights were turned out and all that stuff, he would get out of his bed, go under his bed with like a blanket, and he had a bat under there. And he would sleep with a pillow and a blanket under his bed, under that trundle. And what his perspective was, is when my dad comes for me, he literally was like, I'm going to go down swinging. Like he was going to take the bat and try to if the dad's trying to grab him. And this was a kid who hadn't been hit or physically hurt yet. Same thing though, he's seen the dad hurt the mom and he's going to try to literally go down swinging with a baseball bat. Okay, obviously my hope would be no children are afraid. And these stories are difficult stories. If you think about what those children are going through, it's beyond terrifying, and it's on an ongoing basis, and you never know when the danger is going to come. So in addition to hypervigilance, many have an exaggerated startle response. Oh, good God, is exaggerated 2 G's?
Yeah. Yes.
And we'll talk about, I just want that phrase there, and then in a little while we'll talk about why that's likely to be there. So that's like a foreshadowing of where I'm headed in a minute. Yeah.
What is that? Can you repeat it?
Sorry, I can't read this. So it's like many of these folks, whether it's a child or adult, also have an exaggerated startle response. So like if somebody comes up and frightens me, you get scared and you might laugh if you jump. And then your system sort of settles down.
For folks that have an exaggerated startle response, it's more like they jump more, usually even higher. They'll jump up higher, and they also, their system doesn't calm down as fast as like your average control, as your average person who hasn't been through trauma. They tend to be much more shaky for much longer, and we'll be talking about why that happens in a minute. Okay, so that's environmental stressors. Are we okay up to here? Yeah.
What's the sentence before the one you just wrote?
Nobody can read one right, it's so sad. So it says hypervigilance is created by these prolonged severe stressors. This means one is constantly scanning the environment for signs of danger. So one is constantly scanning the environment for signs of danger. Okay. Can I erase them? Am I going too fast? We're okay? Okay. So that's environmental stressors. The second and third one, I'm just going to do a one partial phrase descriptor for each one because we're going to focus on this one in a minute. So the middle one is drug and alcohol abuse. Now notice I'm not saying addiction. Addiction would fall under this, but I'm saying abuse specifically. So if somebody's using it at an abuse rate, that's a prolonged severe stressor, whether or not they meet all the criteria for addiction. Does that make sense? Okay. And I always just do a short phrase to do with this because your second essay for exam 2 is going to deal with the 6 forms of tolerance where we're going to talk about another component to do with drug use. So the drug and alcohol abuse stimulate the system way beyond what it was designed to experience. Okay, and that's all you need to do for that one because, as I said, your second essay is going to be dealing with some of those issues. The third category is cognitive stressors. And this would include things like severe, untreated, depression. I'm going to put this on one line. Hang on. This is just a visualization for me. Things like severe, untreated anxiety. So it has to be, and the reason why I try to make a big deal about that is because a lot of folks have anxiety, a lot of folks have depression. It's not where I'm headed next time. It doesn't mean everybody who's ever had depression will have what I'm going to talk about coming up in a minute, or everyone who's had anxiety. It has to be severe, untreated cases will put somebody in more this category. Does that make sense? It's not like mild depression or something like that. And where we're headed, but I've got 1 minute, so we're not doing that today, is to talk about some of Sapolsky's research in relation to prolonged severe stressors. So that's where we're going to talk about next time. And then we're going to do a specific application of the neurobiology of child abuse. Okay, so that's where we're headed. You guys are set. Have a good day. Thanks for listening.